Hey guys, thanks for coming back and watching another video. Today we were talking about growing potatoes in 5-gallon buckets, and it is so much easier than you think it would be. You will have tons of potatoes just by having a few buckets around your garden. You can bring them in as the cold or the frost approaches, and then you can take them back out once the winter sets in. You can keep them in your basement, get a grow light, and they'll do great during the entire winter. And by the time early spring hits, you'll be way ahead of the game, and you'll start being ready to harvest those potatoes before you know it. As you can see, my sweet potatoes have taken over this 4x8 bed, and they're doing quite well. But what I want to do for the winter is I want to start some inside the greenhouse, or start them outside and bring them in the greenhouse once our frost approaches. You want to make sure that you have a place to store your potatoes as they grow throughout the winter. If you can do that in a basement or a greenhouse where it doesn't get below 40 degrees and it stays pretty stable, you can get a little bit of air flowing from a fan, and you make sure you continue to water. But next season you'll be way ahead of the game and ready to take your potatoes outside, and they'll start growing like crazy in the springtime. Now, despite what you might think, container gardens actually go back thousands of years to even biblical times, maybe the hanging gardens of Babylon you may have heard of. And so container gardens are not a new idea, it's just the plastic part is a new idea. So one of the advantages you can have in growing in buckets or containers is you can avoid diseases that are often prevalent in the soil in gardens. And so by growing inside of a bucket, you can kind of bypass that and do a better job of maintaining the soil and watching over diseases that might crop up in your raised beds or out in your open garden. Container gardening or bucket gardening can make it a lot easier. Now, another advantage of growing in buckets is you can move them as necessary. Changing seasons give you different points of sunlight in your garden. So in the bucket method, you can move it anywhere in the garden that you need to, and that's a great thing when you need to get more sunlight or less sunlight to your produce, or your, in this case, potatoes. Now, you might think that growing potatoes in buckets limits the harvest you're going to receive at the end of the season, but actually a lot of studies show that you get almost exactly the same yield in this size bucket in open ground for the same amount of seed potatoes you may have started with. So that's the thing to consider, is can you control your ground area as well as you can a bucket? I don't think you can, but you can in an open area. If you're planting hundreds and hundreds of potatoes, obviously you're going to have much more results. But if you're limited in space to, let's say, a balcony or a patio, this is really a great way to do it. It's the easiest way I know of how to do it in a limited space area. So let's head into the greenhouse and take a look, and I'll show you how to put this together, how to assemble the bucket, what to do, and make sure that the potatoes don't rot or you have any problems. So we'll head in there and we'll just put this whole thing together, and before you know it, you'll be growing tons of potatoes in 5-gallon buckets. So the first thing you're going to want to do is start with a food grade bucket and make sure it's safe. You don't want it to have had anything like a chemical in it before you used it. If it was new, you have nothing to worry about. If it came from a bakery or some food processing plant, then you have nothing to worry about. Also, a lot of people don't realize, but you can check the bottom of the bucket, and this number right here at the bottom, do a little research, and you'll be surprised that a lot of buckets, even though they may not say food grade, they're actually safe for food use or food growing. So I wouldn't drink out of it, but it's a lot safer than you think. So besides using a bucket that is labeled as food grade or that is safe for use to grow food in it, you might want to opt for the white bucket. A dark bucket in a warmer climate is going to heat up quicker. I've got some blue buckets. I think they're almost a black color. They're so dark. But this white bucket is going to reflect heat. And so in the summertime, as this is sitting out in the garden, that will help. Now I'm going to show you real quick something you can add to the bucket just as an added barrier to prevent that from happening. Now, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about keeping the heat inside the bucket to a minimum is to use something like this. This is a hot water heater wrap. You can use it in a lot of different applications in your home, but what I'm talking about is putting this around the bucket in the dead of summertime when it's really hot, and you can tape it with some metallic tape, or possibly some, I don't like using duct tape, it just becomes really sticky and melty. But there's a type of tape I've recommended before. It's an electrician's 3M tape, but you can put that down the side, then your bucket, the temperature in it may be stabilized. Now you may need to remove the handle to make it a better fit, but this is just something that you can do that's not that expensive. And a large roll, I think I may have linked it before, I think I bought it on Amazon. I'm 99% sure I did. So I'll link it if it is. If you don't see it, you know I didn't get it from Amazon. But anyways, that will help your potatoes and the soil temperature inside the bucket be a little bit more stabilized. Even if you use a white bucket in the summertime, the heat can collect quite a bit in anything sitting out in open sun. Now, as far as root development goes, you may not want to go smaller than a 5-gallon bucket, because if you go down to a 3-gallon or 2-gallon, it's just not enough space for the roots to develop and get new potatoes in that bucket. So I'm going to say 5 gallons or bigger. I believe there's a 7-gallon bucket, and it's about this tall, and that might be even better, but the price goes on way up on those. Now I'm going to show you 2 other containers real quick, but I'm just going to continue to focus mainly on the 5-gallon buckets today. Now, 2 other types of containers you can consider, and I've talked about these before. This is even larger. I believe this is a 20-gallon grow bag, and it's got handles on it, and it's going to be quite heavy once you get the dirt filled all the way to the top. You're going to start out the dirt, of course, when you first start the potato at a much lower point. But if you want to try this in a grow bag and you plan on keeping the potato in its same original spot throughout the season, then a 20-gallon might work. I think they may make a 10-gallon on this, but I just wanted a really large bag, and these are really nice. I'll link these as well. I use these sparingly, and I think it was just a couple dollars. They're not expensive. Now, the other type of container obviously is a tote or a plastic tub. These are excellent too, but like I said, once the dirt gets filled up in them, it's going to be a little bit harder to move them around because of weight issues. Now, one thing you're going to want to consider when you get the soil in there and as it increases in height as you go through the growing process is you want some type of fabric. This is just a paper towel. You're going to put it in there and make sure that it prevents soil washout. You might even use an old t-shirt, just maybe cut to fit in there, but that will keep soil in the bucket once you've drilled your holes in the bottom, and that will keep the potato happier, but you still have great drainage. But that's one thing you're going to want to remember. Depending on the size of the holes, there's always that possibility over time, and this happens in the bonsai world too, that you will have soil washout if you don't have some type of screen or mesh or something to prevent that from happening. Now, another thing you might want to consider doing is a 2-inch layer of gravel, something that won't fall through your holes that you've drilled in the base. And that's not only to help prevent washout or other problems with losing soil, but it can also act as a barrier for insects that might find their way to those drill holes and find their way to the soil. So that is a dual reason for having the gravel, maybe a 1 to 2 inch barrier of gravel that's larger than the holes you've drilled in the bottom of the bucket. Now, you don't want to use the soil you have just in your yard or a heavy clay soil. You want a light and airy soil mix, and I'll link up above. We make our own potting mix when we have time, and it's very light, very airy, and it will allow those roots to expand. So when you use regular garden soil, it's going to sink and compact and make it hard for the roots to expand. So remember, it's got to be light, something like just a general potting mix, but I'll show you that video that really works well, and it'll save you up to 75% off of really premium potting soil, and it's almost exactly the same. Now, one thing you may want to consider to your potting soil is you may want to add some extra compost for that microbial action in the soil. I use black cow a lot. You can use worm castings, but just something kind of a really rich compost, and that's going to help your potatoes. Also, to add extra lightness and extra oxygen to it, just to help those roots expand as fast as possible. Add an extra cup or 2 of perlite. That will help as well. Now, as a general rule, you want to use organic potatoes or specifically seed potatoes. I picked up a couple of bags of organic potatoes. The seed potatoes can be a little bit expensive because there's some shipping cost involved. And so I like using organic potatoes. A lot of general potatoes are sprayed with a sprout inhibitor, or they're treated with an ethylene gas or something else that's going to prevent them from sprouting in the grocery store. I've got some just regular potatoes in the kitchen, and there's no chits forming as you see on this. I bring you in closer and show you that. But that's one thing to remember, is that if it's not an organic potato, you may have an issue with the chits not forming or sprouting, and you won't be able to have new potatoes. Now, as you can see, there's formation of those chits all over the potatoes, and that is the difference between an organic potato and one that's been treated to not sprout in the grocery store. Some potatoes may stay in the grocery store for an extended period of time. There's a delivery time. There's a lot of other factors that go into that. So that's what you want. You want to see those forming, and if they're not, you probably have a potato that's been treated with a sprout inhibitor. Now, variety is another important thing to consider when you're selecting your potatoes. You have early, mid, and late season harvest. You have a lot of culinary taste that people want. So that's another thing. I'm going to link in the description maybe, I don't know, maybe 10 different potatoes that are well suited for growing in containers and specifically buckets. Now you can put these directly in the soil and not worry about letting the chits form, but if you want to do that, if it's a cold time of the year, put it in a north-facing window with indirect sunlight. If it has too much sunlight, the chits become, the sprouts can become leggy and it won't be as effective. So make sure there's not direct sunlight in the windowsill if you're starting them indoors during the wintertime. Okay, so getting ready to plant the potatoes we have, I'm going to go through a step-by-step process and show you exactly how to do it. We're going to remove our paper towel, and that's our drainage barrier to keep any insects out, keep the soil in. But I'm going to drill some 1/4-inch holes, and I'll probably speed through this process because it's boring and I don't think anybody wants to see that. But I'm just going to drill them, space them evenly, and put maybe 6 or 8 holes on the bottom of your bucket and probably about a 1/4-inch drill bit. Okay, so there was a couple things I haven't mentioned yet, and one is I like to label what's growing in the bucket, the date it was put in, and also that whether or not it needs frost protection. So just as a reminder, I know that potatoes will need that, but I just want to keep that in mind. So just in case I forget. The other thing, before I use the bucket, I'm going to spray some disinfectant in there before the season begins, and also at the end of the season when I'm reusing the bucket for next year. Just take some general Listerine in a spray bottle and spray it inside and wipe it down, and that's going to help kill any bacteria, diseases, germs, whatever might be in there that you don't want getting into next year's crop. So we're going to put about 25% of the bucket first before we put our seed potatoes in there, and I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so our bucket's ready to move on to the next step. Now I'm going to carefully place these on the top of the soil, and I'm going to place the chits facing up. But what I'm going to do is I'm not cutting them off because I haven't done the process of allowing them to heal over, putting wood ash on them. So that's one thing that you can do if you want to just use one potato rather than multiple potatoes. And you can do that, and that will allow you to use just one single potato versus using, as I'm doing here, 3 potatoes. So that's one thing to consider, is you might want to just take one that has some well-formed chits, cut those chits off, but you have to allow that scarring over the place where you've cut it to heal over into kind of a wounded area, and that way it'll prevent rot. So if you put them directly in the soil after you cut them, there's a big chance of rot happening to those initial seed potatoes and losing your potato crop. Now, before I move on to the next process, I want to say something about watering. You want to really drench these potatoes on their first watering to allow good potato to soil contact or seed potato to soil contact, and that ensures that the process gets off to a really good start. Now, another note about watering is you can try to do that with your hand, but you're not going to be able to get very deep in the soil. So I recommend using a really good water meter like this one. I bought it a couple weeks ago to replace my 2 older meters that were probably not functioning as well as they should have. So I'll link this as well in the description. But this one, you can see it goes quite deep, and you can test your moisture at a deeper level in all levels of the soil, just to make sure your potatoes are not going to become waterlogged and at risk of rotting. Now, healing is what makes this entire process work in a 5-gallon bucket. I've marked here where the soil level is, if I can see that. I marked that where it is currently and where our potatoes are sitting. But as the potato grows and sends out its roots or tubers, send out its roots upward, we're going to turn those into more potatoes by adding more soil as they grow up. So that's the key to the growing in buckets, is you want to keep adding that soil until it reaches near the top, maybe a 1/2 inch from the top, and then you allow it to grow out of the pot. But that is the thing that works, that makes everything work in growing potatoes in 5-gallon buckets or any of the other containers, is slowly adding soil as they grow. Now, one thing to remember is do not let the sunlight hit these potatoes, because if they turn green, they can become toxic and even poisonous. Now, one brief sentence about what I just said about toxicity in potatoes. That toxicity is a compound called solanine, and that will turn the potato green, and it is toxic. So make sure that the potatoes, as they're growing, make sure they're always covered with soil. If you have a green potato, don't eat it. Now remember, as you're going through this healing process, you want to continue using that very light soil to allow the roots to expand and to breathe. So it's just we're going to cover them to begin with and then wait till we see the roots coming out. We're not far from our frost, maybe 6 weeks, and then they'll come in the greenhouse. And for a lot of people, they'll come in their garages or some place that's protected. So I'm just going to cover them with just a little bit of soil, spread that around, and I'm not going to compact it in any way. Just make sure there's no tubers exposed. And of course, I'll be watering that heavily momentarily. But that's one thing to remember, is you just want to use that soil that's as light as possible, and you don't want it to compact. You want those roots to be able to expand. I know I'm repeating myself, but that's very important. Now, potatoes love sunlight, and you're going to want to make sure that you put it in a sunny location that's going to get between 6 and 8 hours of sunlight, or even more. So that's one thing to remember. And that's another thing about the aluminum foil type product I put around the outside. That can keep the soil a little bit cooler as those days get really hot. If it gets 80, 90 degrees, that can help protect your tubers from getting the soil itself from getting overheated. Now just remember, if they are growing in the shade, you're going to have more problems with leggy plants and also limited tuber development or no tuber development, and possibly even more diseases happening because of that shade. So make sure you don't try to grow these in shade. I had a friend that tried to grow a vegetable garden in the shade, and I tried to explain to him it would not work, but he didn't believe me. But at the end of the season, he realized I was right. Now, one thing that I like to use as an organic solution to pest control in the vegetable garden is neem oil. And so I use my solo sprayer. These are great. You can go under leaves, on top of leaves. It's really a great little... But anyways, what I'm getting to is you want to use the neem oil, but I like using the sprayer because it saves me from having to doing the hand pump thing so much. So it's really a nice little energy saving device. So anyways, just make sure you use neem oil. I'll link both of these in the description as well, and that will keep your potatoes from being attacked by various insects in the garden. I need to spray my sweet potatoes now because I noticed there was some leaves that obviously had holes in it. So that's one thing that'll be done tomorrow morning. Now, about feeding your potatoes as they grow, I would use something that had a very high phosphorus content, and Schultz Bloom Plus is 10-54-10. That 54 is phosphorus, and that's what helps with the root development. It is just one of those things that you're going to need to do, is add a lot of phosphorus to the soil to get the maximum benefit of growing these potatoes. So I will always recommend Schultz Bloom Plus. I just think it works great because it's got that really high phosphorus. You don't want a lot of leaf development. You want to focus on roots, and that's what phosphorus does. It does that below the soil where you can't see it happening. So if you want to go the more organic route rather than using the Schultz, you can also use bone meal, and it's 2-17-0, I believe. The 17 is your phosphorus, and that again is going to help with your root development. So if you want something that's more natural, use bone meal. I'll link that as well. But that's one of those things, if you're strictly organic, that's one thing that you can consider using. So the last thought about feeding is just remember, don't use anything with a high nitrogen level in it, because you're going to have just too much over the soil growth and not enough happening underneath to form those new potatoes. So something like a general fertilizer that has a very low nitrogen, high phosphorus, that's what we're looking for. Now, once you went through the entire healing process, Hilling, I know my accent's terrible, but once you go through the healing process and you filled your bucket with soil, you have lots of foliage on top. Once you see that foliage starting to wither and turn yellow, that's a sign that your tubers are mature, your potatoes are mature and ready to be harvested, and you can just remove the foliage, dump them out, and see what you got. Now, that might be an oversimplification of just dumping it out. What you might want to do first before you do anything is just try to dig in the soil and see if you can see that the tubers are mature. So that's one thing to remember, that different potatoes have different speeds of maturity, and you'll want to check whatever variety you're growing. You'll want to verify how long it's been in the soil. That's why it's so important to put that tag on there with a date, and you'll just have a better idea of, are these potatoes, or should they be mature at this point? So digging around a little bit in the soil can tell you, rather than dumping it out and then discovering, oh, wait a minute, these are not mature yet. Now, one thing you might want to do, even if you see the leaves and the foliage withering and dying, you may want to wait an additional 2 weeks to allow the skin of the potato to thicken up, and they'll be better for storage. So that's something to consider. If you can be patient for just a couple more weeks, that will ensure that your potato is perfectly ready to come in your pantry or storage area, and you'll probably be a little bit happier with the long-term storage of that potato. Now, once you bring your potatoes inside, you want to store them in a cool, dry, dark location, maybe inside of a tub inside your house, like a storage tub or something like that. Give that 2 weeks for them to go through that process, and then you'll want to long-term store them in a humid, dark place that's cool as well. So you don't want them somewhere where it's like next to a hot water heater or something like that. So that's very important to remember for long-term storage. Now, while you're storing your potatoes, you're going to want to inspect them, if I can get that out, every few weeks. You might set a reminder on your phone just to take a look. What you're looking for is rot or sprouting. You're going to want to remove those potatoes to make sure that they don't affect the other potatoes. So just remember, you're going to need to do that about every 3 weeks during the storing process. Now, if you've started your potatoes early in the spring, or you've waited kind of last minute to start them in the fall, potatoes are very susceptible to cold damage. So if there's a chance of frost, you're going to want to bring them inside a basement, greenhouse, somewhere that the frost will not get to them, because they will be damaged by that. So it's going to be a little bit more work if you're like I'm doing it in the fall, but in the spring, you just want to keep monitor, put a, I think there's an app for your phone that will give you a frost warning each time that's going to happen in your zip code or your area. Now, once you've harvested your potatoes at the end of the season, you might want to think about reusing the soil, but that's actually not a good idea, because potatoes are very, very heavy feeders, and they're going to deplete the soil of its nutrition. So also there's a possibility of diseases in there as well. So you might consider adding this to your compost pile or whatever you want to do with it, but just don't reuse the soil, because it's going to be probably the next year's harvest is going to be much less, and you won't be happy with the overall results. Now, once you're finished with your bucket for the year, you'll want to consider cleaning it out. And I had some, yep, here it is. This is what I always use, just the generic form of Listerine I get at the dollar store or something like that. I just spray it on the inside and wipe the bucket out to make sure I'm not starting diseases for next year. I don't know how long a disease could live in an empty bucket, but it's possible it could be there waiting until the next season. So another thing about these buckets, they're out in the sun quite a bit, and plastics degrade over time, and so they may become damaged. So you might just want to take a look at them. But one thing I'm getting to about your bucket being out in sunlight, when you're not using it, store it inside in the basement, and that way your bucket will last longer. These buckets can last for sometimes more than a decade, maybe 2 decades, if they're well taken care of. Now, during the growing phase of your taking care of your potatoes and allowing them to expand and grow, except for when they are becoming ripe and you see the yellowing leaves, that's normal. But if you're seeing yellow leaves, holes in the leaves, and spotting on the leaves, it could be a sign of a disease, nutritional deficiency, or insect problems. And I think some of the things we've covered in this video with the neem oil and the fertilizers, I think that will correct it. So you just want to keep an eye on them and look at the leaves. That's going to be an indicator. You can also dig around in the top of the soil and see if you can find a small tuber. It should be firm, and you'll just need to make sure you recover that, because remember what we talked about the green potatoes. Now I'm going to give you 10 rapid fire things that might go wrong, or where people might make mistakes on growing potatoes. Now, if your drainage holes at the bottom are not 1/4 of an inch and you're not getting good drainage, that will lead to root rot and a lot of problems. That's probably the number one thing that a lot of people do. They make the holes in the bottom of the bucket too small because they're afraid that their potatoes are going to dry out. But usually the opposite happens. Usually it causes too much moisture in the soil, and it just destroys the plant, root rot, and your days of potato farming are over. A second really big mistake is overcrowding the potatoes. I only have 3 seed potatoes in here. You don't want to put 4, 5, or 6. It's just not enough room in a 5-gallon bucket. And believe me, they're going to expand and grow as you do the healing process and bring it up. You're going to have enough potatoes. If you eat a lot of potatoes, you may want to have 3 or 4 buckets. Another big mistake that a lot of people make is they think they can just use the garden soil from outside, something they just dig up, throw in a bucket, and put the potatoes in there. You want to use something very light, very well draining, and this has a lot of organic nutrients in it. The black cows I mentioned, worm castings, and a lot of perlite, just to make it really light and allow those roots to expand and the tubers to form. Another thing is inconsistent watering and allowing the soil to dry out too much or to have it waterlogged. So that's why it's just a good idea to buy one of these meters that will tell you. This meter has 4 functions. It's temperature, light, dryness, and pH. So that's a lot of different things that can really help your potato harvest. The next thing is people allowing the small aphids or other insects to come in. Initially, it's not a problem, but then it just expands and grows over time. So that's why you'll want to make sure you're using neem oil or diatomaceous earth to make sure that there's no insects destroying your potato plants. The next big no-no is skipping your soil amendments. You want that nutritional added benefit there, those compost and things like that. That's going to help your potatoes in the long run. Now this doesn't apply, the next one doesn't apply to me as much because I have the greenhouse and I have a heated greenhouse. But starting your potatoes too early or starting them too late in the year, too close to the frost date, is going to make it hard. It takes months for this to take place. So if you're within just a few months of your frost date, you may not have enough time, you may not have enough time for your potatoes to form. So remember, you want to know your frost date for your area. I think you can get that from weather.gov. You can put in your zip code and it'll tell you your last expected frost date and your first expected frost date. So you'll know and you won't have to worry about starting too early or too late. Now, getting back to the meter again, talking about the pH of the soil, potatoes prefer generally 5.8 to 6.5 pH. So you can alter that with amendments, but make sure your soil has the right pH. If it's too alkaline or too acidic, you're going to have a problem. But it does prefer to be a little bit on the acidic side, and you can add some peat moss to bring that down if it's too alkaline. But remember, monitoring it with a pH monitor, is going to make it a lot easier for you. The next thing is neglecting to dispose of last year's soil. If you're reusing that soil over, remember I'd said previously that potatoes feed very heavily and they're going to drain the nutrients out of the soil. And so just because you're going to add fertilizer, that may not be enough. There may be micronutrients in there that it needs. So remember, start fresh with new soil each season and remember to clean the bucket out with the disinfectant. Hey guys, so I wanted to say thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I love growing potatoes and they are one of my favorite things to grow. They're so easy to grow and you can store them for so long, unlike a lot of vegetables and produce. Sometimes months and months. You can have a potato anytime you want it. So anyways, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate each and every subscriber. Hey, if you have an idea or a suggestion, please leave it down below. If I said something wrong or you think I misstated, and I do that a lot, just let me know in the comments. I really like reading those critical comments because it makes me think, and if you don't think, you're not learning. Have a great day, guys, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Now I've got to have a baked potato.